If you've ever opened Lightroom and thought, I wish I knew what really makes a difference, you're in the right place. In this video, I'm sharing 7 Lightroom tricks I can't live without, the same ones I use on most of my wildlife image edits. These intentional adjustments will help you master the art of editing and turn a flat photo into something powerful. Let's jump into Lightroom and break these 7 tricks down. I'm going to start with one of my favorite techniques, and I use this a lot to add a lot of mood to an image and also emphasize color contrast. So in this image, we've got some elephants playing in the water, and there is some beautiful warm light on them. I don't want to get rid of that warm light. I want to emphasize that warm light a little bit more. So to do that, you would think, okay, how do we emphasize warm? We add cool. Now, I want to add some cool tones into the darker parts of the elephant here. And I do that through color grading. Going to go to the shadow wheel here, drop down the shadow into a blue color, and you can see it's adding some really nice blue to the image. Now, obviously, it's overdone at the moment. I like to add a lot of color just to see where it's falling. Then through the balance slider, I'm going to isolate this all the way to the shadow side. So with the balance slider, if you add 100 balance, that means it's only adding that color to the shadows. But if you throw the balance all the way to the left, it's adding more of that color into more of the midtones as well. So I'm going to really only add blue into the shadows here. I'm going to drop the luminance of those shadows just to bring a bit more contrast in. I think maybe just tweak the color of this, maybe to about 215 or 216 on the hue. Blending blends this effect into the midtones and the highlights, so you can isolate the blending like that, or you can increase the blending so it falls into the other areas of the image. That's the image without the color grading, and that's with it. You can see it's a very subtle effect there, but it helps add a little bit of mood and some nice color contrast to the image. This next effect is a very simple one, but once you start using it, you won't go back to the traditional way of creating it. In the past, I would add a vignette by going to the effects panel here. I would drop down the amount, drop down the midpoint and the feather, and just remove the vignette from some of those highlights. But let's say I want to move this vignette, or let's say I want to add a different type of effect to this vignette. You can't actually do that. So I prefer avoiding the effects panel here and using a radial gradient instead to create my vignettes. So here I've added a vignette over the image. I'm going to invert that because I want to darken the outside. Now let's darken the outside. We can then adjust the feather, adjust the size of it. You can adjust the placement of it. You can also remove the vignette from your subject. So in this example, let's say subtract subject. That will remove the vignette from your actual subject. So you do have a lot of customization in terms of where you want that vignette to fall. So let's just undo that. We can then adjust contrast in the vignettes. We can adjust highlights, shadows, whites, all of this type of thing. You can add some color temperature adjustments. The sky's the limit. You can really customize this vignette as much as you want. So I highly recommend vignetting using the radial gradient. If you've ever felt stuck while editing or unsure how to take your photo editing to the next level, my Lightroom course was made for that. It gives you a clear, proven system that guides you towards amazing results, and I share all the secrets behind how I create powerful wildlife images using techniques I've developed over almost 20 years. It's everything I wish I had when I first started. This next effect really helps the viewer of the image connect with the subject a lot more. If you look at this image of this lion cub, you can see its eyes are looking down. Now, the eyes are the most important part of most portrait photographs. And I feel like in this example, there is a little bit of life lacking in those eyes. Now, there's quite a lot we can actually do to increase the connectivity with the viewer of this image. And I'm going to do that through some masking. I'm going to add a brush in 2 stages. I'm going to add a brush to the entire eye here. Make sure auto mask is off. We want to paint across the entire eye there and this part here. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is, if you look at this, the eyes appear very, very dark. I need to increase the exposure in the eyes just to allow the viewer to connect a little bit more with the subject. I'm going to add that exposure, and then I'm also going to add some clarity. That's just going to bring out a lot of detail in those eyes there. Maybe add a little bit more detail there. So if I turn that off, you can see we've just increased the exposure in the eye and added a little bit of detail. Let's just zoom out. You can see there's a little bit more connection now with the subject. The second thing I want to do is increase the catch light in the eye. Now there's actually no light present in this image. There's no sunlight, but what you can see is that bright sky reflected in the eyes there. And I'm going to increase the brightness of that. So just going to add a brush. I'm going to just paint in that very small section of the sky there. In this one as well. First thing I'm then going to do is add some whites. Let's see how that brightens that up. I think that's done a pretty good job. I don't want to overdo it. That is way too much, but just a subtle increase in the catch light on the eye there just gives the subject a lot more life. That is without the eye work that we've added, and that is the result now. You might think it's slightly overdone, but then you can just adjust the opacity of your masks or the amount just to fine-tune that to exactly where you want. This next trick I like to use is to add detail to very specific parts of the image. If I'm editing this image, I definitely don't want to add clarity to the background. That is going to emphasize more of those details, and I definitely do not want that. If you can see, if I add clarity, it's increasing the appearance of that background. And to this image, it's actually quite a negative appearance. I don't want to add detail to that background. So if I want to then add clarity just to my subject, I can create a subject selection. Simply then just add clarity, which can work. But also in this image, I don't want clarity applied to this part of my subject here. So you could then essentially just remove that part from the mask there. But I like to use a different method. I'm going to add a brush, going to increase the clarity to 100. And then I'm going to paint on the areas of the image that I want that clarity. Now, you can almost mold the clarity to fit your subject to draw attention, in this example, to the face. Now, I only really want the details in the sharp areas of the image. So you can see that it's really helping to bring out those details. I might just add them to the ears here, although I think that might be slightly overdone. I think let's drop the clarity down to a more tasteful amount, like that. Then you can really just fine tune where you want that clarity to fall. Like I said, I don't want clarity on the side here. That clarity helps draw the attention of the subject to the viewer. And that's essentially what I'm doing through this clarity brush. Then I'll just name this my clarity brush, just so I know exactly what was applied to it. That is the effect before, and that is the effect after. This next technique is something I use fairly often as well. It just helps contour the subject and bring more attention, and in this example, to the face as well. So what I'm going to do is create a brush. Now, if you look at this image, it's got some natural shadows falling, especially underneath the chin here. And I want to emphasize those shadows a little bit more. I want to emphasize the shadow here. And what that does, it just helps bring a bit more depth to the image. By creating those shadows, it just emphasizes a little bit more where the light is falling. So I'm going to decrease my exposure. I'm also going to add a little bit of negative temperature there. I want this effect to be slightly cool. So with a brush, simply just going to paint here. I'm also then going to paint underneath this chin, just making sure to fine tune this to exactly where I want it. I think that's a little bit too broad a selection there. It's going to subtract, especially from the face. Really don't want that effect on the face there. And I might just feather this effect out a little bit. Really only want to isolate it just to the shadow part of that underneath the chin and on the belly there. So if I just turn that off and on, you can really see it's just helped emphasize the light direction a little bit more and also added a little bit more depth to this image. One of my favorite techniques, and it works especially well when you've got a nice distant background in the image like I do here. I've got this leopard sitting on a mound, and in the background we've got some really nice warm lights coming in from the right-hand side. The light was naturally there, but I've emphasized the atmosphere of that light a little bit. So if I take this mask number 2, if I turn it off there, you can see there is beautiful light in the background, but just by adding a little bit of atmosphere to the image, it just helps create a lot more mood. Now this mask is simply just a radial gradient. Let's zoom out to 6%. You can see there's a very large radial gradient applied to this image. And what I've done is I've just increased the exposure, increased the color temperature and the tint, and then also added some negative dehaze. So again, in red is where the effect is falling, and I've feathered that off nicely using this very large radial gradient. There is the effect off and on. Let's zoom in a little bit more. There's the effect off, and there's the effect on. This next effect really helps create some really nice color contrast in this image, especially when a subject is in sunlight like this. You can see there's an egret here on a stick with a very nice distant background. So what I like to do is what I call selective white balance. What that is I'm going to add warm white balance to my subject and cool white balance to the background. Now you can really get creative with this. You can select areas that are in sun, like in this example. You can select areas that are in shade and really play around with that white balance relationship between different elements in your image. So let's select my subject here. I'm just going to create a rough selection here. I'm going to add some nice warmth to the subject here. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate and invert that mask to select everything else, and then simply cool it down. That's obviously a little bit extreme. Let's just drop down the tint a little bit to make it look a little bit more natural. You can then also play around with saturation and all the other effects that you are able to use on the mask. Let's just go back to my subject here. Let's just increase the white balance a bit more. So just through those selective white balance adjustments, we've just brought in a little bit more color contrast just to create a nice interesting effect on this image. If you're dealing with noisy images, these 7 tricks won't help much. They can't fix high ISO noise, and that's something every wildlife photographer faces. There's a way to handle it properly though, and I'll show you exactly how in this next video.